Qin was the first dynasty to unify the core of China under a single imperial state. It was not the dynasty that proved such a state could survive. Its achievement was immense but brief, and the speed of its collapse exposed a problem conquest alone could not solve. A realm had been unified. Rule had not yet been made stable. That is why the Western Han matters so much. Founded in 202 BCE after civil war and fragmentation, it did more than follow Qin in sequence. It turned the first imperial breakthrough into a political order that could outlast the moment of conquest and shape the assumptions of later dynasties. The decisive question is not simply who unified the realm first. It is who made that unification governable over time. That answer should not be romanticized. Han rule proved far more resilient than Qin rule, but it never escaped the tensions built into monarchy, frontier pressure, and concentrated power. The importance of the Western Han lies not only in the territory it controlled, but in the way it learned to hold that territory together. Administration mattered. So did elite integration, fiscal management, frontier strategy, and a language of rule that could command more than fear. Armies could conquer. They could not, by themselves, maintain a realm across generations. What the Han achieved was a conversion of force into structure. The court, the provinces, the agrarian base, and the ideological image of rulership were tied together more effectively than they had been under Qin. The Western Han did not emerge from a calm transfer of legitimacy. It came out of the breakdown of Qin authority and the violence that followed. Rebellion spread quickly. Regional forces competed for power. The Chu-Han contention became the most decisive struggle, but it was part of a broader landscape of collapse rather than a clean succession crisis. That setting matters. Han rule was forged in a world already damaged by overmobilization, rebellion, and civil war. Any regime that hoped to last had to do more than win. It had to restore order without reproducing the same kind of brittle overreach that had destroyed Qin. Still, one thing survived the fall of the First Empire. The idea of a unified realm did not vanish with the dynasty that had first imposed it. Qin left behind a double inheritance. It was remembered for harsh law, heavy extraction, and a speed of collapse that made its power look self-defeating. But it also left something no successor could ignore: centralized administration, territorial integration, standardization, and the demonstrated possibility of ruling at that scale. For the Han, that meant Qin could not simply be dismissed as a failed episode. Its institutions had already changed the political landscape too deeply. Commanderies, records, transport networks, and the expectation of central rule remained in place. The problem was no longer whether China would return to a pre-imperial world. It was whether imperial rule could be made less self-destructive. That is what Han moderation really meant. Liu Bang did not rise as a doctrinal architect of empire. He rose as an effective political survivor. His strengths were flexibility, coalition building, and the ability to draw capable men into his camp while the post-Qin world remained unstable. Against Shang Yu, his advantage was not heroic spectacle. It was endurance, adaptation, and a stronger capacity to turn victory into settlement. That mattered because the Han dynasty began in a practical register. Its early character was shaped less by ideological purity than by negotiation, absorption, and selective continuity. Liu Bang did not create a new order from untouched ground. He assembled one from civil war, precedent, and opportunity. That also left problems behind. The alliances that made victory possible did not disappear once peace had to be administered. Early Han rule did not impose complete central uniformity from the start. It accepted a mixed arrangement, often described as the kingdom-commandery system.
Some regions were governed directly from the center. Others were placed under kings, including imperial relatives and politically important allies whose support still mattered in a fragile post-war settlement. This was a compromise, but not a confused one. The dynasty needed room to stabilize itself. In the years immediately after civil war, distributing authority could be safer than forcing full concentration too quickly. Han rule survived in part because it did not demand institutional purity before it had secured the foundations of control. The cost was built into the arrangement. Regional kings could help preserve early order, but they also preserved rival power inside the imperial framework. The Han dynasty also had to rebuild acceptance of rule after devastation. Qin's collapse and the wars that followed had made force familiar, but they had not made it legitimate. A new regime had to present itself as restorative, less destructive, and more politically bearable than what had come before. That made tone, symbolism, and policy all matter in the first decades of Han rule. This was the founding layer of Han legitimacy. It was not yet the mature moral and ritual system of later imperial self-presentation. It was something more immediate, the effort to make a post-war state acceptable to exhausted elites and subjects. Coercion did not disappear. It remained essential. The change was that power now had to be made more usable, not merely more visible.
Expansion increased reach and strain. Once the dynasty had secured its core, Western Han pushed outward beyond the North China heartland. Its reach extended into the Hixi corridor, into southern and southwestern frontier zones, and toward the Korean peninsula. These were not incidental additions to a settled kingdom. They marked a transition in scale. Territory in this context meant more than land on a map. It meant corridors, routes, defensive depth, garrisons, and strategic access. Expansion changed the kind of state Han was becoming. It was no longer simply consolidating after civil war. It was beginning to shape a wider political world across several frontiers. The farther power moved from the agrarian core, though, the heavier the burdens became. Distance brought new costs in transport, communication, supply, and military maintenance. No frontier mattered more than the north. Conflict with the Xiongnu forced the Han court to confront an adversary that could not be handled through agrarian assumptions alone. The steppe demanded mobility, cavalry adaptation, diplomacy, fortified defense, and long-term strategic thinking. It required the dynasty to operate as a frontier state as well as an agrarian one.
This challenge shaped imperial strategy in lasting ways.
Han rulers had to choose between negotiation, accommodation, punitive campaigning, and sustained military pressure. Those were never only battlefield decisions. They were judgments about prestige, security, and the cost of projecting authority at the edge of the realm. There was no cheap solution. Appeasement carried political embarrassment. Offensive policy demanded men, supplies, and money on a very large scale. Under Emperor Wu, Han power was projected with a new level of confidence. Frontier policy became more assertive. Campaigning expanded in scale. The court acted with greater willingness to mobilize resources in pursuit of security, advantage, and reach. In spatial and strategic terms, this was the most ambitious phase of Western Han rule. What changed under Wu was not only the map. The dynasty began to behave like a state fully conscious of imperial capacity. Its frontier posture hardened, its ambitions widened, and its willingness to act at distance increased. That expansion was real, and so were its rewards. So were its costs. Pressure on finance, manpower, and administration grew with every extension of reach. Empire lasted through systems, not victory alone. Western Han did not survive by abandoning the centralized state. It survived by preserving its essential machinery while adjusting how that machinery operated. Court institutions, commandery governance, legal administration, taxation, and written oversight all remained central to imperial rule. What changed was the political handling of those tools. That adjustment was not softness. It was a method of survival. The Han kept enough continuity with Qin to govern on an imperial scale, but reduced some of the forms of pressure that had made Qin rule collapse so quickly. In practical terms, the state became more sustainable because it became less visibly self-destructive. The structure, though, remained hierarchical and coercive. More measured rule did not mean a gentle state. The regional kings provided one of the earliest tests of whether that settlement could last. The kingdom system had served a purpose in the aftermath of civil war, but semi-autonomous royal power inside an empire carried obvious risks. Those risks became unmistakable in the rebellion of the Seven States in 154 BCE. The importance of that rebellion lies in what it revealed. A large imperial state could not indefinitely tolerate major rival centers inside its own governing structure. The suppression of the revolt, therefore, mattered as a constitutional turning point as much as a military one. It did not solve every problem. It simply shifted the center of danger. As regional threats declined, struggles within the imperial core grew more consequential. Administration was the ordinary basis of Han power. Official hierarchies, written records, tax registers, labor coordination, layered jurisdictions, and territorial oversight gave the dynasty the capacity to govern routinely rather than improvisationally. This is where imperial endurance actually lived. That fact can seem less dramatic than war or palace crisis, but it is more important. A realm of this size did not continue because it possessed grandeur in the abstract. It continued because information could be gathered, burdens assigned, commands transmitted, and localities made legible to the center. A functioning bureaucracy, however, did not make the ruling house immune to instability. It gave the state continuity. It did not guarantee secure dynastic control over that continuity. The foundation of Han power was agrarian production. Peasant households supplied grain, taxes, and labor service, and those resources sustained the army, the bureaucracy, transport systems, and the institutions clustered around the capital. However elevated the court might appear, its strength began in the countryside. This matters because imperial scale depended on regular extraction from ordinary producers. Prestige did not feed armies. Ritual did not move grain. The state required a countryside productive enough to support it and governable enough to keep that support flowing. That created a permanent constraint. The dynasty had to draw heavily from the agrarian base without pressing it to the point of political or social breakdown. Commerce and long-distance exchange widened the reach of the Han state, even though they did not replace its agricultural foundation. Internal circulation linked regions more closely to the center, while corridors such as the Hexi route carried goods, people, and influence across wider strategic space. Their importance was not only commercial. These routes connected frontier policy, diplomatic reach, and material integration. Exchange strengthened Han influence because it tied movement, geography, and authority together. That should not be romanticized. Trade expanded possibilities, but it did not remove inequality, and it did not relieve the agrarian population of its central fiscal role. As the dynasty expanded and military commitments deepened, fiscal policy became more interventionist. Armies on distant frontiers, transport demands, and broader state ambitions required revenue on a larger scale and with greater regularity. Measures such as the salt and iron monopolies reflected that reality. This is a reminder that finance was not peripheral to empire. It was one of the ways empire operated. A state that wanted to defend frontiers, maintain authority, and act across wide territory had to convert social production into usable political and military power. That conversion had consequences. The more actively the court intervened to solve imperial problems, the more visible the burden of those solutions became. Power had to appear rightful. Western Han rule depended on more than administrative competence. It also needed a language of legitimacy that presented imperial authority as rightful, ordered, and morally framed. Court ritual, heaven mandate language, and the ceremonial structure of monarchy all helped place the emperor within a larger vision of political order. That mattered because durable rule requires more than obedience under pressure. It requires hierarchy to seem intelligible. Ritual and moral framing gave rule a shape that could be recognized as proper rather than merely imposed. This did not replace harder instruments of control. It made them more stable by placing them inside a more persuasive public order. Confucian learning gained influence under the Han not by standing outside the state, but by entering into its institutions and self-presentation. Classical scholarship, court patronage, and the prestige of learned advisors helped the dynasty speak more often in moral and civilizational terms. Figures such as Dong Zhongshu became associated with that shift, even if the process was broader than any one thinker. The key point is not that the state became purely Confucian in practice. It did not. The point is that political authority increasingly described itself through ethical and cosmological language. That changed the way rule justified itself and the way the court imagined its own role. Administrative life remained harder than the idealized image. Law, hierarchy, taxation, and coercive capacity still underpinned imperial rule. Han prestige was cultural as well as political. Chang'an, court ceremony, historical writing, scholarship, and the symbolic power of the capital all contributed to a wider image of the dynasty as the center of an ordered civilization. The Western Han did not only govern. It became memorable in a particular way. That mattered because memory itself became part of political power. The dynasty helped shape later expectations about what an imperial center should look like, how authority should be staged, and how history should remember successful rule. Prestige, though, could not solve every political problem. A dynasty might become exemplary in retrospect while remaining vulnerable in its own time. Gaozu mattered because he solved the first problem of the age: how to turn victory in civil war into a functioning settlement. His achievement was not the creation of an ideal state in finished form. It was the establishment of a regime that could survive the passage from battlefield success to ordinary rule. That is why he deserves attention as more than a founder in name. Gaozu made post-Qin imperial government workable. He managed allies, accepted imperfect arrangements, and established the first political balance that did not collapse immediately. It was not a final solution. The structure he left behind still contained regional tensions and unfinished consolidation, but it made the next stage possible. Wen and Jing addressed a different problem. They did not need to win the realm from scratch. They needed to steady it. Their reigns are associated with restraint, recovery, and a less abrasive governing image, but their deeper importance lies in consolidation. They helped turn an early settlement into something more settled. This was a different kind of strength from conquest. It lay in preserving order, reducing political shock, and reinforcing central authority without making every act of rule feel like an emergency mobilization. In historical terms, they helped give Han rule depth. That achievement should not be mistaken for softness. Their restraint worked because the state already possessed real coercive capacity, and because unresolved tensions still required later rulers to act more forcefully. Emperor Wu addressed yet another problem: what kind of power the Han state would become once its foundations were secure. Under him, the dynasty presented itself with greater scale, greater confidence, and a more expansive understanding of imperial authority. His reign altered not just what the state did, but how it conceived itself. That is why Wu stands so prominently in historical memory. He redefined the style of rulership at the center of the dynasty. Expansion, activism, ideological elevation, and military assertion all came together in his reign to produce a more visibly imperial court. The result was impressive, but it was not costless. Wu enlarged the dynasty's presence and prestige while also passing on heavier obligations to those who followed him. A stronger center could still be captured. Western Han developed substantial state capacity, but it never solved the problem of who controlled access to the center. Consort families, regents, and powerful court elites could dominate the environment around the emperor, shape appointments, and direct influence from within the core of government. This reveals one of the central contradictions of monarchy. Concentrated authority can strengthen the state. It can also raise the value of controlling the ruler, the court, and the channels nearest to power. A stronger center does not eliminate political struggle. It can intensify it. That is why court capture should be treated as a structural risk, not as incidental palace gossip. Succession exposed this weakness repeatedly. Minor emperors, regency politics, and uncertain transfers of authority showed that even a capable imperial system still depended on fragile human arrangements. Institutions could organize territory and revenue. They could not remove uncertainty from dynastic transmission. That distinction is essential. The state could remain functional while the ruling house became vulnerable. One of the most important developments of the late Western Han was the growing gap between administrative continuity and dynastic control. The empire, in other words, could still work even as the dynasty's grip on it weakened. By the late Western Han, strain was accumulating beneath the appearance of continuity. Court competition, factional imbalance, narrowing legitimacy, and elite concentration did not immediately disable the state, but they weakened the balance that had once connected dynasty, court, and governing authority. That is the point to emphasize. Decline was not simply a story of failing institutions. It was the erosion of a political equilibrium. The machinery remained in motion, but confidence in the order directing it was becoming thinner and more contested. Once that balance eroded far enough, takeover from within became easier to imagine than collapse from without. Wang Mang's rise should not be treated only as the story of an exceptionally ambitious man. His ascent became possible because late Western Han politics had already concentrated influence within regency structures and court networks. Dynastic weakness created the conditions in which extraordinary authority could gather around a single figure at the center. Seen this way, usurpation was both an event and a symptom. It showed that the relationship between the ruling house and the state apparatus had already been damaged. The institutions of empire still existed, but the dynasty no longer controlled them securely enough to prevent capture. That does not make Wang Mang inevitable. Structural weakness created the opening. Particular actors still moved through it. In 9 CE, Wang Mang seized power and brought the Western Han to an end. The importance of that moment lies in more than dynastic replacement. The fall of Western Han did not mean that imperial rule itself had been discredited as a political form. The ruling house fell. The larger model did not. This distinction matters enormously. Western Han ended because dynastic legitimacy lost command of the imperial center, not because large-scale empire had ceased to be workable. The dynasty broke before the governing logic it had helped stabilize did. That is why restoration later remained conceivable. The House of Han could fall, and yet the world it had shaped could still imagine rule in recognizably Han terms. Western Han established enduring norms of imperial government that outlived the dynasty itself. Bureaucratic monarchy, central administration, ideological framing, and the memory of an ordered imperial center all became part of the inheritance of later Chinese history. The dynasty mattered not only for what it achieved in its own time, but for what it taught later rulers to expect from the empire. Its influence was therefore both institutional and civilizational. Later dynasties inherited more than offices and procedures. They inherited a political language shaped by Han experience, how rule should justify itself, how the court should stand at the center, and how authority should be remembered. That legacy was formative, but not pure. The Han model carried forward strengths and dangers together. The dynasty ended. The imperial model remained.